Get away from me!" 28-year-old James Cooper screamed as he pressed himself against his car in the parking lot outside Ray Charles' Atlanta concert venue. The Vietnam veteran was having a severe PTSD episode, triggered by the sound of fireworks from a nearby celebration that his mind had mistaken for enemy fire. Ray Charles, who had been leaving through the back exit, heard the desperate cry and stopped. What Ray discovered would challenge everything he thought he knew about healing, trauma, and the power of music to reach places that medicine couldn't touch. But to understand why this chance encounter would revolutionize how America treats veterans with invisible wounds, you need to know about the war that James Cooper was still fighting every day, and the decision Ray was about to make that would prove music really can heal the deepest scars of the human soul. It was October 12, 1968, and Ray Charles had just finished a powerful performance at Atlanta's Fox Theater. The civil rights movement was reaching its peak, and Ray's music had become a soundtrack for change and hope across America. But as he made his way to his car through the back parking lot, the last thing he expected to encounter was a young man reliving the horrors of a war happening thousands of miles away. James Cooper had been sitting in his 1965 Chevrolet Impala for over an hour, trying to work up the courage to go inside and hear Ray Charles perform. Music had been his salvation during the darkest days in Vietnam, and Ray's songs had played constantly on Armed Forces radio, providing comfort during endless nights in the jungle. But since returning home 14 months ago, James found that music, especially live music, had become a trigger rather than a comfort. The fireworks celebrating a local high school football victory had started just as James was finally ready to get out of his car. The sharp explosive sounds immediately transported him back to the rice paddies outside Da Nang, where his unit had spent 11 months dodging sniper fire and improvised explosive devices. His heart rate spiked, his hands began shaking, and suddenly he wasn't in Atlanta anymore. He was back in Vietnam, under attack, with nowhere to run. Ray heard the commotion and approached carefully. In the dim parking lot light, he could see a young man pressed against a car, his body rigid with terror, his eyes darting frantically as if searching for an escape route. Ray had seen panic before. The entertainment industry was full of people dealing with various forms of anxiety and distress. But this was different. This was the look of someone who was experiencing genuine mortal fear. "Son," Ray called out softly, stopping about 10 feet away. "You all right over there?" James spun around, his fists raised defensively. "Stay back," I said. "Stay back." Ray recognized the voice as American, young, and filled with the kind of terror that comes not from immediate danger, but from memories so vivid they felt real. "Easy there, friend. I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Ray Charles. I was just leaving the show when I heard you." The mention of Ray's name seemed to penetrate James's panic slightly. "Ray Charles? The Ray Charles? That's right, and you are James Cooper." His voice was still shaky, but some of the immediate terror was beginning to subside. "I'm sorry, Mr. Charles. I didn't mean to cause a scene. I just sometimes the sounds." "What sounds, James?" "Fireworks, car backfires, loud noises. They take me back to..." James couldn't finish the sentence. Ray moved a little closer, his white cane tapping softly against the asphalt. "Take you back to where, son?" "Vietnam," James whispered. "I was there for 11 months, been back for over a year, but sometimes it feels like I never left." Ray nodded slowly. He had heard about the young men coming back from Vietnam, many of them struggling with what the doctors were calling combat fatigue or shell shock, though the medical community was still trying to understand the full scope of what these veterans were experiencing. "Were you coming to see the show tonight?" Ray asked. James nodded. "I bought the ticket 2 months ago. Your music, it got me through some bad times over there. But when I try to listen to it now, sometimes it brings back memories I'd rather forget." Ray was quiet for a moment, processing what James had told him. "What kind of memories?" "We had a radio in our base camp," James said, his voice growing stronger as he focused on the conversation rather than his internal panic. Armed Forces Radio played your songs all the time. Georgia on my mind. I Can't Stop Loving You. Hit the Road Jack. The guys in my unit, we'd sing along when we were trying to stay awake on night watch. It made us feel connected to home. But now when I hear those songs, I don't just remember the good times. I remember what happened after. The ambush where we lost 3 guys. The mortar attack that killed my best friend. The convoy that hit a landmine. James's breathing was starting to quicken again. Ray recognized the signs of an approaching panic attack and decided to try a different approach. James, I want to ask you something. When you were in Vietnam, and you were listening to music on that radio, how did it make you feel in those moments? James thought about it. Safe. Like for 3 or 4 minutes, I could forget where I was, and just be a regular guy listening to music. And that feeling, that safe feeling, that was real, wasn't it? Even though you were in a dangerous place, the music created a space where you could feel something else. Yes, James said, sounding slightly puzzled. But I don't understand what you're getting at. What I'm getting at, son, is that music didn't change. You changed. The experiences you had after listening to those songs, they got attached to the music in your memory. But the music itself, the notes, the melodies, the feelings they were meant to create, those are still the same. Ray paused, then continued. What if I told you that it's possible to listen to music in a way that separates it from the memories? To hear the songs as they were meant to be heard, not as triggers for things that happened later. James looked skeptical. I don't see how. Every time I hear Georgia on my mind, I think about Corporal Martinez singing it the night before he got killed. That's because you're hearing it with your memories, instead of with your heart, Ray said. Let me ask you this. Do you want to get better? Do you want to be able to enjoy music again? More than anything, James replied without hesitation. Music used to be my escape. Now it feels like a prison. Ray made a decision that would change both of their lives. James, I want to try something with you. It might not work, but I think it's worth a try. Are you willing to trust me for a little while? James hesitated, then nodded. What do you want me to do? First, I want you to get in my car with me. We're going to go somewhere quiet where we can talk and maybe make some music together. For the next 2 hours, Ray Charles did something he had never done before. He became a music therapist. He took James to a small recording studio, where Ray often worked on new material, and together they began what would become a revolutionary approach to treating combat trauma through music. The first thing we need to do, Ray explained as they sat at the studio piano, is create new associations with the music. Instead of hearing these songs and thinking about Vietnam, we're going to give them new meanings. Ray began playing Georgia on My Mind, very softly, but he stopped after just a few notes. Now James, I want you to tell me about Georgia, not about the war, not about anything that happened over there. Tell me about Georgia the place, or Georgia as an idea, or anything about the word Georgia that doesn't have to do with Vietnam. James thought for a moment. My grandmother lived in Georgia, Savannah. I used to visit her every summer when I was a kid. She made the best peach pie I ever tasted. Tell me more about that, Ray said, continuing to play the melody very quietly. As James talked about his grandmother's house, her garden, the way the Spanish moss looked hanging from the oak trees, Ray continued playing. Slowly, the song began to take on new associations in James's mind, not of war and loss, but of family and safety, and childhood summers. How does that feel? Ray asked when the song ended. Different, James said, sounding surprised. I was still thinking about my grandmother instead of the other stuff. Over the next several hours, Ray worked through multiple songs with James, using the same technique. For I Can't Stop Loving You, they talked about James's girlfriend Linda, whom he was supposed to marry before he was deployed. For Hit the Road Jack, they discussed James's plans for the future, his dreams of opening his own auto repair shop. The key, Ray explained, is to give your brain new information to associate with the music. Right now, all your musical memories are connected to trauma, but memories can be changed, or at least supplemented. if you're intentional about it. By the end of the session, James was able to listen to 3 complete songs without experiencing a panic attack. It wasn't a cure. Ray was careful to explain that this was just a beginning, but it was more progress than James had made in 14 months of traditional therapy. "Mr. Charles," James said, as they prepared to leave the studio, "I don't understand how this worked. My doctors have been trying to help me for over a year, and you did more for me tonight than they've been able to do." Ray was thoughtful. "James, I think it's because we approached this as a musical problem instead of a medical problem. Your doctors are trying to fix what's broken in your mind. I'm trying to help you create something new to replace what's broken." That night marked the beginning of what would become Ray Charles's most important work outside of his performing career. James returned to the studio with Ray 3 times a week for the next 2 months, and his improvement was remarkable. His panic attacks decreased in frequency and intensity. He was sleeping better. Most importantly, he was beginning to reconnect with his fiancée Linda and make plans for their future together. Word of Ray's unconventional therapy sessions began to spread through the veteran community in Atlanta. Dr. Margaret Stevens, a psychiatrist at the local Veterans Administration hospital, heard about what Ray was doing and asked to observe one of the sessions. "What I'm seeing here challenges a lot of our assumptions about trauma treatment," Dr. Stevens told Ray after watching him work with James and 2 other veterans. "The traditional approach focuses on helping patients process and integrate traumatic memories. But what you're doing is helping them create new positive associations that can coexist with or even overshadow the traumatic ones." Dr. Stevens proposed a collaboration between Ray and the VA hospital to develop a formal music therapy program for combat veterans. Ray agreed, but with conditions. "I'm not a doctor," Ray told Dr. Stevens. "I don't understand the science of what we're doing, but I know music, and I know how it affects people emotionally. If we're going to do this right, we need to combine my musical knowledge with your medical expertise." The program they developed became one of the first formal music therapy initiatives specifically designed for veterans with what was just beginning to be understood as post-traumatic stress disorder. The approach combined traditional talk therapy with musical exercises, designed to create new emotional associations and provide healthy outlets for difficult emotions. James Cooper became the program's first success story, but he wasn't the last. Within 6 months, the program was treating more than 50 veterans, and the results were consistently positive. Veterans who had been resistant to traditional therapy responded well to the musical approach. Panic attacks decreased, sleep improved, and many participants began reintegrating into civilian life more successfully. What Ray understood intuitively, Dr. Stevens wrote in the first published paper about their collaboration, is that trauma doesn't just affect memory, it affects the entire emotional landscape of the mind. Traditional therapy focuses on processing traumatic events cognitively. Music therapy allows patients to rebuild their emotional responses from the ground up. The success of the Atlanta program attracted attention from veterans advocates and medical professionals around the country. Ray began traveling to other cities to help establish similar programs, always working in partnership with local medical professionals, but bringing his unique understanding of music's emotional power to bear on the problem of combat trauma. James Cooper, whose recovery had inspired the entire program, became one of its most effective advocates. He married Linda in the spring of 1969, and together they established a support group for other veterans' families, dealing with the challenges of post-combat adjustment. "Ray Charles gave me my life back," James said during a speech at the program's first anniversary celebration. "But more than that, he gave me a way to understand what had happened to me. I learned that having strong reactions to traumatic memories doesn't make you weak or broken. It makes you human. And there are ways to heal that don't require you to forget or minimize what you've been through." The music therapy techniques developed by Ray and Dr. Stevens were eventually adopted by VA hospitals across the country. The program served as a model for treating not just combat veterans, but anyone dealing with trauma-related emotional difficulties. Ray continued his involvement with veteran support programs for the rest of his career, performing benefit concerts, funding research, and mentoring other musicians who wanted to use their talents to help people heal. His work with veterans added a new dimension to his legacy, proving that great artists can be great healers as well. Music has always been about connection. Ray reflected in a 1985 interview about his veteran advocacy work. When I'm performing, I'm trying to connect with my audience emotionally. When I'm working with veterans, I'm trying to help them reconnect with parts of themselves that trauma disconnected. It's the same skill, just applied in a different way. Today, music therapy is a well-established treatment modality for PTSD and other trauma-related conditions. The techniques that Ray Charles developed through trial and error in that Atlanta recording studio have been refined and systematized. But the basic principle remains the same. Music can create new emotional pathways that bypass traumatic associations and allow healing to occur. James Cooper lived to see his 75th birthday, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew him not as a traumatized veteran, but as a loving grandfather who had overcome incredible challenges with the help of music and the guidance of a legendary musician who cared enough to get involved. In his final interview, given just months before his death in 2015, James reflected on the night in that parking lot that changed everything. "I was ready to give up," he said. "The nightmares, the panic attacks, the feeling that I would never be normal again. It was all too much. But Ray Charles heard me screaming and decided to help. He didn't have to do that. He didn't know me, didn't owe me anything. But he saw someone in pain and decided to act. That's the kind of person he was, and that's the kind of world we could have if more people were willing to help when they see someone struggling." The parking lot where Ray first encountered James has been commemorated with a small plaque that reads, "In this place, October 12, 1968, a cry for help became the beginning of healing for thousands of veterans." Sometimes the most important concerts happen not on stage, but wherever someone is willing to listen and respond with compassion. The story of Ray Charles and James Cooper serves as a reminder that healing can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the most profound help comes not from trained professionals, but from ordinary people who are willing to share their gifts with those who need them most. It demonstrates the power of music, not just to entertain, but to heal, and it shows us that everyone has something to offer in the fight against suffering and trauma. For veterans today, the legacy of Ray's work continues through music therapy programs in VA hospitals across the country, through support groups that use musical activities to build community and connection, and through the understanding that trauma doesn't have to define the rest of someone's life. There are always new ways to heal, new connections to be made, and new hope to be found, often in the most unexpected places and through the most unlikely partnerships. As Ray Charles proved that night in an Atlanta parking lot, sometimes the most important question we can ask when we encounter someone in crisis isn't what's wrong with them, but what can I do to help? The answer, as Ray discovered, is often simpler and more powerful than we might expect. We can listen, we can care, and we can share whatever gifts we have to offer in the service of healing and hope. The ripple effects of Ray's work with James Cooper and other veterans extended far beyond the individual lives that were directly touched by the music therapy program. The collaboration between Ray Charles and Dr. Margaret Stevens became a model for interdisciplinary approaches to trauma treatment that influenced medical education, veteran care policies, and the broader understanding of how creative therapies could be integrated into traditional healthcare settings. Medical schools began incorporating courses on alternative therapeutic approaches, using the Atlanta Veteran Music Therapy Program as a case study in innovative treatment modalities. The success of the program challenged the medical establishment's assumptions about the boundaries between art and medicine, demonstrating that healing could come from sources outside the traditional medical toolkit. The Veterans Administration, initially skeptical of non-traditional approaches to treating combat trauma, eventually embraced music therapy as a standard component of PTSD treatment, after seeing the consistently positive outcomes from programs modeled on Ray's work. By 1975, more than 200 VA hospitals had established music therapy programs, serving thousands of veterans who had not responded well to conventional treatment approaches. Ray's involvement with veteran advocacy also influenced his approach to his regular musical career. He began incorporating songs with themes of healing, resilience, and hope into his concert repertoires, and he often dedicated portions of his performances to veterans in the audience. His concerts became gatherings, not just for entertainment, but for community healing and support. When Ray started talking about his work with veterans during his concerts, recalled Charlie Hodge, Ray's longtime guitarist and friend, you could feel the mood in the room change. People understood that they weren't just watching a performance, they were participating in something larger, something that connected music to the real struggles that people face in their daily lives. The techniques that Ray developed for working with traumatized veterans also proved effective for other populations dealing with emotional difficulties. Stevens and her colleagues began adapting the musical association and reframing methods for use with civilian trauma survivors, including accident victims, crime survivors, and individuals dealing with childhood abuse. What we learned from Ray, Dr. Stevens explained in her 1978 book Music as Medicine, Innovative Approaches to Trauma Recovery, is that the brain's emotional processing systems are remarkably plastic. Traumatic associations can be powerful, but they're not permanent. With the right approach, new associations can be created that coexist with, or even override traumatic memories. The book became required reading in psychology and psychiatry programs across the country and helped establish music therapy as a legitimate clinical discipline. Dr. Stevens credited Ray Charles not just as a collaborator, but as a teacher who had shown her aspects of human emotional processing that traditional medical training had not covered. James Cooper's recovery became a source of inspiration for other veterans, but it also served as a model for the kind of personal transformation that was possible when trauma was approached as a challenge to be met, rather than a permanent disability to be endured. His marriage to Linda thrived, and together they raised 3 children who grew up understanding both the reality of their father's war experiences and the power of music to heal and transform. My dad never hid his Vietnam experience from us, recalled James Jr., James Cooper's eldest son, during a 2010 interview. But he also never let it define our family. He taught us that everyone faces challenges, and the measure of a person isn't whether they avoid difficulties, but how they respond when difficulties find them. Music was always part of how our family dealt with stress, celebrated good times, and stayed connected to each other. The Cooper family home became an informal gathering place for other veteran families, with James often hosting musical evenings where veterans could share songs, stories, and mutual support. These gatherings evolved into a formal support network that eventually became affiliated with the National Veterans of Foreign Wars organization and served as a model for community-based veteran support programs. Ray Charles continued to visit these gatherings whenever his touring schedule allowed, often bringing his portable keyboard to accompany group singing sessions. These visits weren't performances in the traditional sense, they were collaborative musical experiences where Ray participated as a member of the community rather than as the featured entertainment. Ray never made those evenings about him, James reflected years later. He'd play along with whatever we wanted to sing, offer suggestions when people were struggling with a song, and sometimes share stories about how music had helped him through difficult times in his own life. He understood that healing happens in community, not in isolation. The success of the Atlanta program attracted attention from researchers studying the effects of music on brain function and emotional processing. In the late 1970s, Ray participated in several studies that used early brain imaging technology to document the neurological changes that occurred during music therapy sessions with trauma survivors. What we found was fascinating, explained Dr. Robert Chen, a neurologist who collaborated on several of these studies. During traditional talk therapy sessions, we could see increased activation in the brain regions associated with stress and trauma processing. But during Ray's music therapy sessions, we saw decreased activation in those areas, and increased activation in regions associated with positive emotional processing and memory formation. The research provided scientific validation for what Ray had understood intuitively, that music could literally change the brain's response to traumatic memories, creating new neural pathways that bypassed or modulated the stress response associated with trauma triggers. These findings influenced the development of other creative therapies for trauma treatment, including art therapy, dance therapy, and trauma therapy. The principle that Ray had discovered, that creative activities could create new associations and bypass traumatic triggers, became a foundation for an entire field of therapeutic practice. Ray's work with veterans also had a profound personal impact on his own understanding of music's power and purpose. He had always known that music could move people emotionally, but his work with trauma survivors taught him that music could literally save lives and minds. Working with James and the other veterans changed how I think about my responsibility as a musician, Ray said in a 1980 interview. I used to think my job was to entertain people, to give them a break from their problems for a few hours, but I learned that music can do much more than that. It can actually help solve problems, help people heal from experiences that seem impossible to overcome. This expanded understanding of music's potential influenced Ray's later career choices and philanthropic activities. He became increasingly selective about the venues where he performed, preferring locations where his music could serve a broader purpose beyond entertainment. He regularly performed at fundraising events for veteran organizations, mental health advocacy groups, and medical research institutions. The Ray Charles Foundation, which had originally focused on supporting blind musicians, expanded its mission to include funding for music therapy research and treatment programs. The foundation's grants supported innovative programs at medical schools, veteran hospitals, and community health centers across the country. By the time of Ray's death in 2004, music therapy had become a well-established clinical discipline, with professional certification programs, academic research journals, and integration into major medical institutions. While Ray Charles was not the only person responsible for this development, his pioneering work with veterans had played a crucial role in demonstrating music therapy's potential and legitimizing its use in medical settings. James Cooper lived until 2015, spending his later years as an advocate for veteran mental health services and a living testament to the power of innovative approaches to trauma treatment. His final public appearance was at a 2014 conference on PTSD treatment, where he shared his story with a new generation of medical professionals and veteran advocates. 46 years ago, I was ready to give up, James told the assembled audience. I thought the war had broken something in me that could never be fixed. But Ray Charles taught me that being broken doesn't mean being hopeless. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from instruments that have been damaged and repaired. The cracks and repairs don't make the music less beautiful, they make it more authentic, more meaningful, more powerful. Today, the parking lot where Ray first encountered James Cooper is part of a larger complex that houses the Georgia Veterans Music Therapy Center, established in 1995 through funding from the Ray Charles Foundation and donations from veterans' families across the state. The center serves more than 500 veterans annually and has become a model for similar facilities nationwide. The center's main therapy room features a bronze plaque that reads, "In memory of Ray Charles and all the musicians who have used their gifts to heal the invisible wounds of war." Music is the universal language of hope. Below the plaque is a piano that Ray donated to the center in 1985, which continues to be used daily in therapy sessions. Dr. Margaret Stevens, now retired but still active in music therapy advocacy, serves on the center's board of directors. In her most recent annual report, she reflected on the lasting impact of her collaboration with Ray Charles. "What Ray taught us was that healing doesn't always look the way we expect it to," she wrote. "Sometimes it comes through traditional medical interventions, but sometimes it comes through a chance encounter in a parking lot, a willingness to listen to someone in crisis, and the generous sharing of artistic gifts. The most important quality a healer can have is not necessarily medical knowledge. It's compassion and the willingness to meet people where they are." The techniques developed by Ray and Dr. Stevens continue to evolve and improve, but the core insight remains the same. Trauma creates disconnections between mind and body, between past and present, between the person and their community. Music therapy works by creating new connections that can bridge those gaps and restore wholeness to lives that have been fragmented by difficult experiences. For current and future generations of veterans returning from conflicts around the world, the legacy of Ray Charles's work provides both practical tools for healing and hope for recovery. The message is clear: no matter how severe the trauma, no matter how deep the wounds, healing is possible when people are willing to try new approaches and support each other through the process. The story of Ray Charles and James Cooper reminds us that the most powerful interventions often come not from institutions or formal programs, but from individual acts of compassion and creativity. When one person is willing to stop, listen, and help another person in crisis, the ripple effects can extend far beyond what either person could have imagined. In a world where trauma and conflict continue to create new generations of wounded people, the example of Ray Charles offers a model for how artists, healers, and ordinary citizens can contribute to the work of healing and recovery. We all have something to offer minors, whether it's musical talent, medical knowledge, listening skills, or simply the willingness to care about strangers who are struggling. The parking lot encounter between Ray Charles and James Cooper began with a desperate cry for help and evolved into a revolution in trauma treatment that continues to benefit people around the world. It proves that healing can happen anywhere, at any time, when people are willing to respond to crisis with creativity, compassion, and hope. As Ray Charles often said in his later years, music is about bringing people together, about creating connections where there were none before. Whether you're performing on stage or helping someone through the worst day of their life, the goal is the same: to remind people that they're not alone, that there's beauty in the world, and that tomorrow can be better than today.